Welcome everyone to our second Africa Talks event this year, which builds on a discussion we had last year with colleagues from Cornell, LSE and Chatham House, focused on the impact of COVID-19 on Africa's food security. Today, we reflect on what challenges and opportunities exist for the African continent in terms of a food secure future. However, before we begin our conversation, I have an exciting announcement to share with all of you. Today marks the first day the Firoz Lalji Center for Africa formally becomes the Firoz Lalji Institute for Africa. This moment marks the start of the year-long launch of the Firoz Lalji Institute for Africa, where we will be hosting a myriad of events and activities throughout the academic year for you to get involved in. We would like to express our deep gratitude to Firoz and Lajma Lalji and their family for their generous support in helping us to establish the centre 5 years ago and helping us develop into a fully fledged LSE Institute. These achievements would not be possible without their belief in our mission. The work of the Institute in the years to come will be to reach across the school to promote the visibility of Africa in LSE's teaching, research and policy engagement. We will work tirelessly to widen participation and access to the LSE from African students and African scholars and to bring African perspectives to LSE. Reflecting on this past year, our programme activities have continued to expand despite the current situation. Notably, our events programme has expanded its online presence, allowing us to reach more people across Africa. Responding to the wave of Black Lives Matter protests last spring and the increasing spotlight on systematic racism in higher education, we've established the Decolonisation Hub to support anti-racism at the LSE and beyond. A wealth of useful resources can be found on our webpage. The research programme has expanded its reach by becoming truly multidisciplinary, welcoming new and innovative projects on COVID-19, public health, South-South relations, resilience datafication, social networks, humanitarianism, and public policy. Furthermore, our African engagement programme and programme for African leadership have been pivotal for doing this work and supporting current trends by offering bespoke workshops on career planning, project management, mental health and well-being, and the introduction of an internship programme launching this summer. So, if you haven't engaged with our work yet, we encourage you to do so. This year, the Institute will be working to establish the Africa Trade Programme, led by Dr. David Luke, host exciting seminars and events, hopefully some in the flesh, rebrand our physical space at the school to welcome you back in person, continue to deepen our connections and engagement with Africa. These are just some of the exciting aims we have for this year. We hope you will join us. Thanks so much for attending today's event, and I now hand you over to the chair.
Thank you, team, and thank you all for joining us today. My name is Stephanie Levy. I teach and I conduct research in the Department of International Development at LSE. I'm thrilled to be chairing this event today. I was present when Team Marta and our colleagues opened the center 5 years ago, and it is my pleasure to be part of the launch of the Institute with this event today. I would like to add to team presentation that for many of my students and many LSE African students, the center has been supportive, stimulating, enabling for them to unleash their potential. For many of my students, it has greatly contributed to making their experience of studying at LSE rich, fruitful, enjoyable. So I'm grateful for all of this. I'm grateful for the center for all of this. I would now like to introduce our three speakers. So we have the privilege of having with us today Sara Mbago-Bhunu, who is the director of the East and Southern Africa Division at the International Fund for Agricultural Development. IFAD. Sara has over 20 years of experience in agriculture and rural development across Africa. She has worked on agricultural policies, access to agri-finance, value chain development, and much more. Welcome, Sara. Thank you for joining us. Jane Ambuko is an associate professor and head of the horticulture at the Department of Plant Science and Crop Production at the University of Nairobi in Kenya. Her research focuses on sustainable and appropriate solutions to reduce post-harvest losses in Africa, so extremely relevant to what we are discussing today. She works with smallholder farmers and value chain practitioners to build capacity and to promote technology adoption. I am particularly grateful to both of you to be here today. I know that it is Madaraka Day in Kenya, so happy day, and thank you for joining us, especially today. Abebe Haile-Gabriel is FAO Assistant Director General and Regional Representative for Africa at FAO. Abebe has more than 30 years of extensive experience at national and international level, focusing on agriculture and rural development in Africa. Welcome, Abebe. Thank you for joining us. So each speaker will present for 10 to 15 minutes, and we will then open a discussion session, a 30-minute discussion session for all of them to exchange on the future of food security in Africa, to compare their experience. During the third part of this event, speaker will answer questions from the audience. So please write your questions in the Q&A box that you have in the bar below. You can do so during the presentation and during the discussion, and I will direct your question to our speakers during the third part of this event. So, Abebe, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Stephanie. Distinguished participants, I'm very happy to be with you today. Sara and Jane, very happy to be one of the speakers joining you. Good afternoon from Accra, Ghana. And thank you for the opportunity to speak today on a topic that is so central, so important. Now, I would like to start by saying a few words about how the African situation could be a little bit different, because we are talking about the food security and agriculture in Africa post-COVID-19. So the background is COVID-19. And so the first point I want to make is that Africa's agri-food systems are defined by vulnerability to multiple and overlapping shocks. So it's not just one particular shock. There are many, and they are overlapping. So we have the issue of having to deal with these multiple and overlapping shocks and threats. Some of them are climate-related shocks, others transboundary pests and diseases. You may have heard the desert locust in East Africa, the fall armyworm has been with us, the conflicts, very widespread in Africa, the economic downturns or slowdowns, and so on. So even before COVID-19 pandemic, in 2019, there were 250 million hungry people in Africa, so even before COVID-19. And the prevalence of undernourishment increased from 21.2% in 2015 to 22% in 2019. So it's not only that the problem was there, but also it was increasing even before COVID-19. Healthy diets have become out of reach for nearly 3/4 of Africans because they are simply not affordable. Over half of all Africans, about 51%, cannot afford a nutrient adequate diet. And of the 185.5 million people globally who cannot afford an energy sufficient diet, the vast majority, about 80%, live in Africa. COVID-19 is an additional shock, so which has definitely further compounded the problem. And so this would present Africa's context to be somewhat unique. But also there is another aspect, which is the second aspect that would make the African case unique. And this is the absence of effective and adequate mechanisms to manage the impacts of those shocks. For example, African governments, with very few exceptions, could not provide what's called stimulus packages, similar to what many developed countries have done, mainly because of the fiscal constraints. These capacities have been further dwindled because of public health emergency considerations due to COVID-19 pandemic. Now, there are recent reports from FAO on the impacts of COVID-19 and evidences from field assessments. I just want to share with you, for example, increased levels of food insecurity in 2020. COVID-19 may have added between 23 to 39 million people to the ranks of undernourished in 2020 in sub-Saharan Africa. Agri-food SMEs, small, medium enterprises, suffered the most. And this through decreased sales, difficulty accessing raw materials and inputs, reduced availability of workers, and so on. The vulnerable groups have been disproportionately affected, including women, rural youth, smallholder farmers, pastoralists, artisanal fisherfolk, migrants, seasonal workers, internally displaced persons, and so on. So the impact of reduced incomes on food security and nutrition is huge for this group of people. FAO's recent report finds that globally, up to 1 billion people would be unable to afford a nutritionally adequate diet if a shock reduced their income by 1/3. Just note, a potential reduction in income by 1/3 could increase the number of the number of people who would face challenges meeting the nutritionally adequate food to 1 billion. There are concerns that most African economies won't be able to provide post-pandemic recovery options. Recovery is likely going to be slow and uncertain because the crisis is still unfolding. So this is the kind of context we have. Second problem is that the agri-food systems in Africa feature a lot of inefficiencies. These are caused by structural deficits. If we look at the resource inefficiencies, the resource use inefficiencies, we find that the source of agricultural growth in Africa has largely been through expansion of the cultivated area, not through increased production. And this has been occurring at the expense of forests, grasslands, and other uses, rather than from increased productivity. Another study by FAO, which is very recent, on land use changes between 2000 and 2018, indicates that about 12 million hectares of forests were cleared and converted to cropland. Water use efficiency has been the lowest compared to other regions, showing only marginal improvement over time. If you look at irrigated agriculture, it is still in single-digit percentage point, averaging about 7%. Failure of rains in just one season could have devastating impacts and could wipe out whatever little progress may have been achieved. These practices are not sustainable, clearly. In addition, there are significant leakages along the agri-food value chains. Post-harvest losses in Africa are estimated to be about 14%. Of course, it varies from product to product. And this is one of the largest against a backdrop of low production levels overall. The task of food processing usually falls disproportionately on women in many African countries, women spend on average 4 hours per day pounding grain. There is huge dependence on food imports. Weak intersectoral linkages, market and institutional failures, for example, low farm gate prices running parallel to high urban food prices within relatively short geographical distances. So these are examples of how constrained the agri-food systems are. Coming to solutions. Now, transformation to a more efficient, a more inclusive, a more resilient, and a more sustainable agri-food system provides a lasting solution. And FAO encapsulates strategic actions around 4 interrelated betters. Better production, which is a basic foundation, because unless the productivity of agriculture is enhanced through efficient resource use, Africa's agri-food sector cannot make a headway. Second is a better nutrition, that's enabling availability and access to energy, nutritious and healthy diets. And the third is better environment, green towards green and climate resilient agri-food systems. And 4 is a better life, improved livelihoods and better life for all. So in the African case, we need to remember that smallholder agriculture is predominant. Here, agriculture is not only the source of food, it's also the source of incomes. So better access to productive resources, to information, to technology, infrastructure, markets, and so on is key. Naturally, these reside not just within the ministries of agriculture as such, but mostly in several sectors, such as trade, industry, health, infrastructure, energy, environment, and of course, finance. Hence, multi-sectoral engagement and coordination remains to be very, very important. A relevant question to ask would be whether public policies and practices have not systematically neglected agriculture and the rural sector. In other words, is the agri-food sector a priority, a policy priority in Africa? Available figures on allocation of public investment in agriculture could be good indicators in this regard. For example, as percent of GDP, it fell from 0.64% in 2001 to 0.15% in 2018 Africa-wide. That it is not only low, but also has been declining over time. Compare this with the commitment that African leaders have made to allocate at least 10% of national budgets to agriculture in the framework of CAADP, the Comprehensive Africa Agricultural Development Program. The agri-food systems also involve several actors and stakeholders, not just farmers and government. Hence, multi-stakeholders engagement is absolutely necessary. This is also an aspect of the inclusive process. So in terms of policy, governance, and investment, we may need to focus on the following. First, address issues related to access to resources and opportunities to rural producers and disadvantaged social groups, example, women, youth, and so on. Second, address the infrastructure deficits in its both soft and hard aspects, digital agriculture, but also roads, storage, processing, transportation, logistics, skills, and so on. Third, address the issue of incentives to invest by relevant actors across the agri-food value chain, bringing value to the farmers, to rural producers, to the consumers, the investors, and so on, such as factoring in consumers as significant stakeholders for health and nutritious diet, for example. Fourth, address vulnerabilities through well-designed and implemented mechanisms to strengthen resilience. And fifth, effective multi-sectoral approaches and engagement of partnership and multi-stakeholders. Another point is about emerging regional and global opportunities to support transformation, what opportunities there are. On the demand side, the fact that each year Africa imports food worth tens of billions of dollars is a good indicator of the size of Africa's food markets. With the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement entering into force, the African food markets are growing. The UN Economic Commission for Africa estimates that The entry into force of the free trade agreement would expand intra-regional trade in agri-food products by 20 to 30% by 2040. On the supply side, the potentials for increased productivity and opportunities for agri-food transformation are huge. For example, according to some estimates, Africa could be 2 to 3 times more productive. The Africa Development Bank estimates that the value of annual agricultural output could increase from the current level of 280 billion US dollars to as much as $1 trillion US dollars by the year 2030. Advances in technology, in innovation, are providing immense options in generating knowledge and providing solutions to increase productivity. New digital technologies are driving the agri-food transformation process at a faster pace that has never been experienced before, shifting how agricultural value chains are organized, providing new opportunities for more and better jobs, entrepreneurship, and innovations to address the binding constraints in agri-food systems. The development of post-production segments of food value chain, I'm sure Jane will speak to it, including processing and logistics, could particularly have a big impact on productivity, competitiveness, and job creation. The youth can take advantage of such opportunities to support the process, as well as to benefit from it. I would like to conclude by outlining some imperatives towards making this happen. First is about getting the narratives right. There is a need to debunk some of the inherited narratives that agriculture is not economically attractive business and that the youth is not interested in agriculture. Agriculture is not just about tedious farming. It can be modernized, it can be made more productive and economically rewarding. Second is about exploring into what is emerging and the need to grab it as an opportunity. Example, digital innovations. Also, nature-positive solutions in the context of the Food System Summit, in which Africa can have comparative advantages and make a significant contribution. Third is about bridging the missing middle between the globally available, the global scale options that are available globally, and the local and national level capacities, which are constrained. The fourth is about the need to have effective dialogue and engagement, multi-sectoral as well as multi-stakeholders. I believe that effective institutions and leaderships are key towards making this happen. I thank you. Over to you, Stephanie.
Thank you, Abebe, for this very inspiring presentation. Sara, would you like, I'm happy to pass the floor on to you if you are ready.
Yes, thank you very much, Stephanie. And I think I follow through very well after Abebe has set the scene around the challenges facing the African continent, agriculture and food systems. I would not go into further explaining the challenge that he went very well into the details of what is ahead. But IFAD, the International Fund for Agricultural Development, really is here as an assembler of development finance. So having heard a little bit about the challenge and the gaps that we face, the challenge, of course, is to assemble, to develop and provide development finance solutions which are tailored, innovative, adaptive, relevant, and also ambitious, because we have only 10 years left to attain the Sustainable Development Goals. We need to unlock capital and wealth and crowd that in different ways. This is really the challenge. And for IFAD, we have set a new target of 1.5 billion in our new replenishment financing cycle that starts in January 2022. Enabling us to have a program of loans and grants of about 3.8 billion. So this is the biggest and most ambitious we have ever wanted to have, so we can actually move the needle by 2030. So why is this important? I think, COVID impacts are multifaceted. We've already heard that. Currently, African nations are facing a shortfall of about 285 billion until 2025, according to the IMF. So overall, there's a real need for liquidity, not only to fight the pandemic COVID from a health perspective, but to also preserve buffers for future shocks that we heard Abebe talk about, and also try to return to the path of growth and catch up so that we can actually accelerate that growth to pull significant numbers of poor people out of poverty and combat hunger. So this is one of the biggest impacts of COVID-19 has been, in fact, the decline in growth, literally from an average of 5%, 6%, the continent is now experiencing 1.9 and even less than that. And this really is inadequate for the growth needs that Africa needs, which is between 7 and 10%, to meet the aspirations of a very youthful population and to become more secure, more resilient, and definitely more prosperous. So that said, how are we going to be able to do this? Just to give you an example, for instance, the demand for popular produce from Kenya, avocados, the South African citruses, and even vegetables from Morocco experienced a knock, 8.5% decline in exports to Europe. And Europe has been the biggest importer of those fruits and vegetables from the countries I talked about. Tea as well, destinations like Iran, Pakistan, and United Arab Emirates. So all of this has caused contraction, so very few revenues coming into government. And at the same time, small-scale farmers are not able to access important inputs like seeds and fertilizer, which are actually imported for their needs. So we are facing a big crisis going forward, and there's absolute need to crowd in every investment there is in order to have inclusive, sustainable rural economies, engaging youth and becoming more vibrant. So what do we see? What is the position of smallholder farmers? Abebe mentioned a little bit about its impact, but in fact, smallholder farmers and smallholder agriculture is invaluable for food systems. To date, we know that 50% of all of the food calories consumed in the globe are from smallholder farmers, and 30% who own 30% of the agricultural land. In Africa, this is 80%, just to give you the scale. So 80% of our food comes from smallholder farmers. So it's even more important that we address it. Unfortunately, we're unable and have been unable to incentivize smallholder farmers. What we have been recognizing, the 95% of whom are subsistence smallholders, is just for the food that they produce, and largely dependent on rain-fed systems. And with increasing water stress that has been mentioned, which is decreasing by around 30% every year until 2050, this is really a very bad worst case scenario. We will not be able and continue to underperform in feeding ourselves. What if we can actually incentivize these smallholder farmers for all the types of services they provide? And by saying that, I'm talking about beyond food, they also provide fuel, pollination, ecosystem services, pest control. They help regulate soil fertility. They help sequester carbon. They help control erosion. They promote nutrient recycling, water management, etc. They help protect watersheds and landscapes. Are there mechanisms and instruments that we can use? And indeed, IFAD has tried to do this and introduce these types of systems to really be able to recognize the full role and capabilities of what smallholder farmers can bring. Beyond what we have been trying to do, IFAD has been very adaptive and nimble. We have developed a special purpose vehicle called the Rural Poor Stimulus Facility as part of an effort to grant in concessional finance to mitigate against the disruptions caused by COVID, imports access to agricultural inputs, access to markets disruptions in that, and also the heavy load on loans that some of the smallholder farmers have actually received. So we're addressing 4 key areas and trying to crowd in digital in that process through the RPS facility. We set aside 40 million of seed money, and we have been able to mobilize quite a bit. Our ambition is 200 million to meet these disruptions. A very good case, if I may just explain, in Ethiopia, for instance, we have seen that our smallholder farmers were hit with the lack of access to labor, agricultural labor, because of lockdown. I've already mentioned limited inputs, production capital, which has impacted on their production and productivity and basically obstructed their access to markets. And yet they have been unable to sell to service their small loans, nor actually save. They've been digging into their savings. With reduced employment, reduced access to food, and increased responsibilities for women, there has been really a spark in vulnerability for smallholder farmers, particularly women, and an absence completely of jobs. We have partnered with the EU to try and mitigate this, and we have crowded in a special resource, a special fund to enable SACCOs, village SACCOs and saving schemes that we have been working with to actually delay the repayment period for these microloans. And we have seen that this has had quite a big impact because the burden of the loan when there is no economic activity and when you cannot farm has been a huge relief for smallholder farmers in the context of Ethiopia. And this grant has been invaluable in really stabilizing the liquidity of these village rural savings and credit schemes. So that's been one very concrete example of what we have done there with the special purpose vehicle. In the case of South Sudan, it took a little bit longer because of capabilities and capacities there, but there again, we've been able to really come in and offer a very unique series of interventions. There we have aimed to touch 23,900 vulnerable rural people, roughly 4,780 households. And with the grant, we have tried to address a number of things. The grant value was $706,000. And the idea was to provide tons of seeds for maize, sorghum, groundnuts, and selected vegetables at the beginning of the planting season, really targeted. And in addition, provide fisherfolk. Fish is quite a good source of protein, and also there's quite a lot of inland lakes that the South Sudanese use for fishing, with kits for fishing. And we were able to, which consists of hooks, nets, pools of twine, etc. We've also given them training on production technologies, and also provided them with a very interesting, and maybe Jane will pick this up, on equipment ready, adaptable tools to reduce post-harvest loss. Such as these little granaries, little hematic bags, some coolers, silos, threshers, and even refrigeration. And we are seeing out of the 50% of the beneficiaries who are women and young people, a complete bouncing back, where they are now able to actually plant because they receive the seeds on time, and they actually have coupled that in with adaptive storage facilities, really being impactful. And so going forward and trying to summarize what the Rural Poor Stimulus Facility has actually done, we have been able to provide, for instance, in East and Southern Africa, to all eligible countries. We have been using the vulnerability index to select the countries of choice. Not all of our countries were immediately selected under the scheme, because we have really attempted to look at the most vulnerable and those most exposed to shocks. And the Inform COVID-19 Risk Index was the reference point. And in there, we used a couple of criteria. Globally, IFAD has funded 59 countries, and the grants have been between 0.2 million to 1.2 million as the largest types of grants under this scheme. It did take a toll on colleagues, the teams, trying to respond very quickly in a very short productive line. We had to introduce specific and special guidelines to ensure that this as an instrument worked. But we are very happy, and we see that the immediate returns, because these short-term measures, short-term stimulus, rural packages, are really being able to allow communities right across Africa, those who were either needed at planting season to gain what they needed, and those who were at harvest to really be able to safeguard those harvests to ensure food security. And I must say, in terms of the digital solutions that we used as an opportunity to address COVID, they ranged from cash, mobile money transfers in Zambia, to voucher type agri-input schemes. We also use digital platforms for market access, and agriculture extension. So this has been really exciting because the large bulk of our more traditional sovereign loan type operations had been struggling to introduce digital solutions. But we found with this and with COVID, there was a real opportunity to crowd it in, and the impacts of this are quite incredible. I could go into more details later. So thank you very much, Stephanie, and back to you.
Thank you, Sarah. It's a very interesting presentation. Jane, the floor is yours if you want to take it. Are you? Yeah, hi.
Yes, good evening. My internet is not so good today. I hope I don't drop off while in the middle of my talk. But yeah, let's. So thank you so much for inviting me to this important session, and I'm glad to be on this panel with Sara and Abebe. From FAO and IFAD. Those are our big institutions. So I come in from the university from research, and like you introduced me, Stephanie, I'll bring it down to the low level. I work with farmers, and so I'm gonna just share experience of, the plight of our farmers, the smallholder farmers that Abebe and Sara have talked about, who really suffered a lot because of the containment measures that were put in place. Especially some of them are still in place, obviously, but there's a time when things were really bad, and as a person who works with smallholder farmers, it pained me, wondering what can be done better, because it is like Abebe said. I mean, when we talk about a smallholder farmer in Africa, it's not just about food. This is their livelihood. This is where they get income, for other expenses, be it education for their children, be it, healthcare. It is all, coming from their farms. So when you find that they cannot make ends meet because of the restrictions that were put in place, then you feel the pain. You feel the pain of the farmers. And I know the food supply chain was affected by the COVID restrictions, but I would zero in on the effect of these restrictions on the food, the perishable food, because incidentally, the perishable food you're talking about, the fruits, the vegetables, the meat, the fish, the milk, these are the nutritious foods that we were all encouraged to eat. As part of our, defense, protective measures against the virus. But then these are the foods that were not available, especially to the urban, the urban poor, in quotes. Let me just the people who cannot afford. You had Abebe mention that already people in urban areas are not eating enough of the nutritious food. Why? Because it is expensive, it's not available. It is bad. It was bad enough before the pandemic. Now worse because of the pandemic. So I'm going to just look at paint the situation as it was, and it still continues, but it has improved a little bit, and it can get better. Okay, as you've heard that most of the food that we eat in Africa, most of the food, all the food commodities are produced by smallholder farmers. But especially for fruits, vegetables, this is most of what we eat is really purely smallholder, right? So, and you realize that these commodities, the fruits, vegetables, roots and tubers, really have an informal system. Yeah, the supply chain is really informal. There's no, especially for the domestic market, is very informal, in the sense that first of all, most of this produce is from the rural areas, and transportation is informally. There's no organized transport or something like that. So, for example, and the supply chain is generally very long and complex. For example, to get, let's say, a sack of potatoes. Remember, the producers are smallholder, so a sack of potatoes is possibly what they can harvest at a go. To get that sack of potato to the market, for example, in the urban areas. It changes hands so many times, like I said, the supply chain is long and complex. So you understand by the time it gets to the retail shop near my house, for example, it has moved through like 6 people. So it's a long supply chain, complex, really in between their middlemen, the brokers. So this informal and inefficient supply chain was really affected by, these restrictions, right? So you find that, okay, fine. So yes, the food will still get there, but then the system that it follows to get there is long. So when the restrictions were put in place, these informal systems, most of the time, the food is moved together with people, so there's no organized transport. And you realize at the height of the pandemic, there was restriction of movement of people. So the vehicles that move with the food from the rural areas to the urban areas were restricted. So we find that the farmers in the rural areas who depend on this informal market or informal transport could not move their produce to the urban areas, which is like their target market. So what ended up is the wastage, the losses at the farm. So there's no, and of course, I don't know if it's Sara or Sara mentioned that Kenya exports a lot of fruits and vegetables to Europe. Yeah, so that market also was disrupted. But for the domestic market, which is informal, was off. So you can imagine, even those who target export market, the produce that is aimed for export could not move their produce, right? Because the informal system that moved this food was seriously affected. And then the ripple effect to that is that these smallholders also supply small-scale traders in the urban areas. And the small-scale traders, you're talking about the small kiosks where most urban families would buy their fruits and vegetables from. So that supply chain was totally disrupted because of the lockdown and all those containment measures. So ultimately, what I'm saying is that the access to the nutritious food for the urban population, especially the urban poor, the people who actually, you'd say, live hand to mouth, they buy today for today, that was affected. Okay, and while that was happening, food was rotting away in the fields. The farmers who depend on this produce for their livelihoods, their livelihoods were affected significantly. Here, farmers that you work with will call and asking, do you know anybody who could be looking for this? But there's only so much you can do. You have a whole acre or half an acre of fruits or vegetables, and there's nothing to do with it. There's, not because the demand is the food is not required, but it's like, how do you move it? There are only certain licensed transporters, the formal system where food was moving. So looking at that, so for us, we're looking as university, as our research team, what you're looking at is what intervention, what strategies can be put in place to actually ensure that really this scenario that is not just COVID, any emergencies that will happen. In Kenya, you've heard of what we call the post-election violence, which is a cycle that happens and people are cut off from, food supplies. So these are emergencies that really need interventions. These would be, better interventions to ensure that food distribution, systems that link producers, to markets, and while ensure that consumers do not have disruption in, access to quality food. And I'm zeroing in on fruits and vegetables because those foods are usually they suffer most when you have this kind of situation, lockdowns or emergencies. So we have to address the infrastructural, the technological, the logistical challenges that would affect distribution of food. So what we've been trying to do, working with the national government and county government, is to promote the concept of village, local, regional aggregation centers, which would serve as food reserves. Usually when you talk about food reserves, in most cases, people just think about cereals or pulses or basically the grains. So in here, national strategic reserves, basically that's all about grains. Nobody thinks about strategic reserves for nutritious foods like fruits, vegetables. So what you're trying to say, how do we promote, because in many, you'll hear national strategic reserves, but how about regional, local, village level, strategic reserves, where we have, really, collection or aggregation of produce. And like the previous speaker said, for us to do this, we must have the infrastructure required. We're talking about cold storage for the perishables, for fruits and vegetables, for roots and tubers, for milk, for meat, cold storage. Because without cold storage, basically that is why food was wasting, because your produce is ready. There is no market. Food is demanded elsewhere. Even if government wanted to buy and distribute this food to the people that needed it at the height of the pandemic, where would they get it? They can't go to look for it in the village, right? So basically this needs government, in national and local government, to actually strengthen infrastructure that is required, whether it is cold storage, whether it is warehouses or storage facilities for non-perishables, localized, regionalized, to where actually, the farmers in the rural areas can actually aggregate this produce. And of course, the aspect of small-scale processing, devolving process. You realize, for example, in most African countries, find somebody is producing milk in a village, but they have to move it to some urban center for it to be processed, for it to come back to the village, for me to buy it from the shop. These are things that can be done, localized, so that we have really, process, even fruits and vegetables, we can actually localize, decentralize, so that farmers do not have to move fruits to the urban centers for it to be processed into juice so that it can be sold back in the village as juice. It is not the process facilities that we require. And this is what we've tried to do with our smallholder farmers, to actually train them how to value add their produce locally. This way, we're talking about ensuring that regional, local self-sufficiency, especially during emergencies, so that people can actually, access food. I know my time is up, but basically what you're saying is, when we have this kind of devolved system, we need to then link them to whether it's aggregation centers for fresh produce or processed produce, link them to markets. And the markets could be urban markets. It could actually be, safety, safety nets, those programs where like government is trying to avail food packages to the vulnerable communities. Where do they get that if we do not have, like localized sort of collection, aggregation? So this is what we're trying to push, supporting, this kind of system through, technology that is required, either for storage or for processing, so that then this devolved is of course, we're trying this on pilot, but we see this as a way of actually ensuring that, first of all, the farmers are linked to, market, but also, food reserves are just, food is not following such a long chain for people, especially in urban areas, to access it. So you shorten the supply chain and make, improve livelihoods for the, the local actors, whether they're farmers, they're traders, they're processors. I think this is I think we can talk more as we go into the queue. I can see my time is up. But yeah, that's what I wanted to say. That's what we're trying to argue, because I work directly with the smallholders, in that we need solutions that can actually, help to address these restrictions that have been occasioned by, this pandemic. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jane. Thank you, Sara and Abebe. Those presentations were extremely stimulating and interesting. I have a few questions that I think you will a few questions that come to mind when I listen to your presentation. Some of them actually echo what we receive as well from the audience. So I would like to ask about the impact that COVID has had on the policies in the African countries where you work, whether there's been a renewed interest or shift towards intervention that enable and promote food security to mitigate the impact of COVID, in the same way what we've seen with a social protection program. Have you witnessed the same kind of changes in the countries where you work? Maybe we can start with this angle and then talk more about the changes that have occurred as a response to COVID. Sara, do you want to start?
Yes, thank you, Stephanie. Indeed, I think the whole idea of rural stimulus packages, and also, as Jane added, the need to intervene in urban areas for the poor is something that has really been on the agenda for many of the countries that we work with, and solutions for financing that immediate. So I talked a little bit about liquidity needs, and one hand to deploy emergency relief measures, whether they are in social protection, but also for health, for COVID. That was very clear as one of the priorities, policy priorities. But also in the short term, really looking at preparedness and, disaster risk financing, and be able to be responsive and having those buffers we talked about in order to mobilize, particularly for the informal sector. And most of the economies that we work with have large informal sectors. We saw that the liquidity, facilities springing up right across different East African countries for small and medium enterprises who were really hit with liquidity, and therefore governments really requested specific grant facilities to be able to support also informal workers with social protection. So indeed, we have seen this. Now, we also know that the African Continental Free Trade Area is there. There's a desire in the very short to medium term to fast track that and to harmonize and align markets, integrate the East African community more, shorten supply chains in that sense, clean out all the trade barriers that are preventing goods from moving from Uganda, Kenya, and Tanzania. Those food corridors are cut across these essential countries. So there's been also, again, room to support informal trade. So by introducing testing methodologies through digital that you can present at the border, once you leave a capital and you get to the border with Uganda, present that and have those capabilities at border crossings. So many innovative things. And I think the final thing I would like to say is that this whole One Health discussion has become very, very important now. There's renewed an understanding and deeper understanding about having One Health under regional settings. So basic phytosanitary gaps in poultry, livestock systems across the different countries in East or Southern Africa can have a huge impact. And therefore now there's been a big discussion as well with health sector to say how can we harmonize and work closer together to be, because health is a pillar now for economic trade and agriculture. So I stop there.
Yeah, I think it will echo very well what Abebe was presenting before. Abebe, would you like to tell us about the policy changes you have witnessed, and maybe also how FAO has supported those, please?
Yes, Stephanie. Let's start to look at it chronologically. When remembering, we all remember how COVID, started and how the world responded to it at the beginning. Of course, it was a public health concern, and in developed countries, the governments responded, reacted very aggressively in terms of locking down. The terminology itself was locking down. And Africa was a latecomer, and in Africa, governments, of course, tried to copy what developed countries have done, but not fully. Developed countries did lockdown, but they complemented it with measures to support households and firms struggling because of the lockdown measures. In Africa, the focus was on lockdowns without having put in place the necessary mechanisms. And therefore, we could note that people could suffer, could die of hunger and malnutrition by being locked down. The health concern, which is a public health concern, and this is legitimate. So one of the things that we did, and FAO among other partners were at the forefront, making a very strong advocacy towards considering food supply as an essential function so that it can be protected. Because these kind of stories are very relevant to understand how policies evolved. Together with the African Union and other partners, including IFAD, Sara, she was part of this, the African Development Bank, the World Bank, the NEPAD, the AU Development Agency NEPAD, the European Commission, WFP, we came together and we said we have to raise the profile of the food supply system in Africa to the highest policy making. So we used the African Union platform to convene the ministers of agriculture as early as April 2020. And that ministerial conference was very instrumental in identifying the priorities for action to respond that countries needed to be taken. The same ministerial conference established a joint steering committee co-chaired by FAO and the African Union and the other, including IFAD and World Bank and the other organizations I mentioned as members. And the idea was now to go back to the countries to see where the gaps are, how the country can be supported, what are the kind of changes that needed to be made in the area of policies, programs, if there is a need to reprogram. And the international financial institutions, IFAD, the World Bank, African Development Bank, were willing to work with the governments to reprogram, to meet those gaps. And it was very, very successful. So we went with the countries, we followed it through our country offices, supported the governments to do the assessments and provided the policy guidance, and they came up with response plans. And then many of the governments were able to get the necessary technical and financial support to design and in fact redesign some of even the social protection interventions, strengthen. One of the things which the COVID has done was expose the weakness of the social protection mechanisms in the countries. And so we use the opportunity to strengthen it. Later on, and you heard me talk about the multi-sectoral engagement. In July, we managed to bring together ministers of agriculture, ministers of trade, and ministers of finance, again, convened by the African Union in the context of this partnership, to see what the ministers of finance and trade could do to support food supply systems and the food security and nutrition issues in the country. Again, identifying priority areas for action, and the task force were following and reporting on a regular basis. So the question, to respond to your question, the answer is yes. There has been a renewal of, in fact, remember I was talking about policy neglect of agriculture in general. So what we were trying to do was to emphasize that this is a priority. If you don't pay attention to the food systems, you can focus on the health systems, that is fine. And Sara very beautifully spoke about the One Health that we have been promoting together with OIE, the World Health Organization, as well as with UNEP. That is one thing, but we have to have a holistic approach, and unless we protect the food systems, the food supply systems in Africa, and we source our food not from supermarkets in Africa. In many places, it is the informal sector, as my colleagues have spoken about. So we needed to protect that. It's also a source of livelihood. It's not just about food supply. It supports a lot of people as their source of livelihood, and therefore the emphasis was to really raise the profile of agri-food systems. We believe we have managed to raise it. Farmers were able, through these changes in policies and practices in many parts of Africa, to plant timely. The data, for example, shows the data that we collected. Those regions where the planting season did not coincide with those lockdown measures, agriculture did not really suffer. It was resilient in many regions. So it's different. So we believe that it has worked. Advocacy for policy change, it works. There is a lot of awareness that was created, not just by ministers and ministries, but among all the stakeholders. So my answer is yes, positive. It's a good lesson that we have learned.
Yes, thank you. I think this, what you described, echo very much what we find in other parts of the world, like in Southeast Asia, for example, where we work, or in other countries where the LSE conduct research of this type. We have found exactly this kind of policy response. The question, of course, then is for how long is it going to last? Whether the changes are, sustainable also from a fiscal perspective. So yeah, it's very interesting. Jane, do you want to contribute to this? Answering this question?
Yeah, well, I'm not a policy person, but I'm going to say that I think we often you know how our government ministries work. There's Ministry of Health, there's Ministry of Agriculture. You know, there's usually no connection between those. But I can tell you during this pandemic, these ministries, especially going back to the issue of nutrition and access to nutritious food. One of the programs that I really appreciated that came up as a result of response to the call to why people must eat nutritious food. Now the Ministry of Health and the Ministry of Agriculture working together to ensure that especially urban population having access to nutritious food. So government, the Ministry of Agriculture introduced a program of promoting kitchen gardens, and even donating these what do you call them, the story vegetable garden for urban families. And then we started to see this now the Ministry of Agriculture people in the Ministry of Health working together to raise awareness about the importance of nutritious food to to your defense mechanism of defense against COVID. And so you could see that now the two ministries now working together, one complementing the efforts of the other, because agriculture wouldn't otherwise feature in matters of health. But now the fact that we need nutritious food, now it's fine. Government actually rolled out a whole program to promote this nutritious food. People eating nutritious food, people accessing, kitchen gardens in their balconies. So there's a whole program on this. So for me, that was something that usually it is something that we know we need to eat nutritious food, but there has never been a push from government to encourage people to eat nutritious food. But this program under Ministry of Agriculture was a good thing. That was, I would say, a product of the challenges that were brought due to people not having access to nutritious food, especially in the urban areas.
Yeah, it's extremely interesting to see how opportunities can arise in circumstances like those one who are tragic, where actually the future of food security can be placed at the center of your action and of policies as well, which is what we all hope for. Thinking about those issues further, I'm wondering what kind of research evidence you would need in order to develop your program further. What is it that researchers, and that's the question that maybe Jane will also like to, the answer that she would like to hear. What kind of evidence do you need that are different in the case of COVID, which are to help you in your programming? How has it changed the evidence that you need? Is there a specific area that you think will be helpful? Abebe, do you want to start?
Yes, again, very, very valid question. Now, I want to contextualize this with the concept of resilience, because the background is COVID-19, and we're talking about post-COVID-19, and we're talking about high vulnerability of the agri-food systems in Africa, and therefore building resilience is very important. And so the kind of evidence we need to achieve in order to achieve the objectives. Number one, how are the interventions can help prevent, because you cannot avoid the shocks. This time we're talking about COVID-19. I mentioned a lot of other shocks. The desert locust in Africa was devastating, and so on. We could not stop it, but we could manage it. So how can we anticipate? How can we anticipate in terms of planning and therefore the need for strengthening data and information? That is very important. How can we enhance the capacity of smallholders and others vulnerable to be able to absorb the shocks? So the issue of, because some of the shocks affect directly their asset base. We are talking about livestock, for example, who serve as draft power for agriculture. And a shock such as drought, heat strikes right at the production assets. So how can we strengthen a system that can absorb the shock, but also for the system to adapt, and of course to transform.
Yeah.
There is a lot of talk about what government should do to support smallholder agriculture and so on. In the African case, evidences have indicated that, yes, it is desirable, but in actual fact, it's not going to change dramatically, however desirable it could be. Of course, we have to make advocacy for policy support and so on. How can we really strengthen the capacity of local actors, farmers, the youth, the women, institutions, producers, organizations, and so on, for them to play important roles to provide not only the required services, but also for them to be vibrant economic activities in rural areas.
Thank you.
So for me, there is a lot of, what is the incentive? What kind of incentive should be available for smallholder farmers, for example, or the youth in rural areas to invest in interventions that strengthen the resilience for prevention, for anticipation, for better absorption, for adaptation, and so on. And then what kind of evidence do we need? Do we provide? Okay, why should I invest in something unless I know that it's economically rewarding? So the evidence, I see the researchers, it is really incumbent upon researchers to provide that kind of evidence to show that investment in resilience actually pays off.
Yeah.
That's how we can convince the ministers of finance to allocate additional resources. That's how we can advise the investors, providing evidences that their investment is not just wasted and so on. So it's a big question. It can have lots of answers.
Yes, and I think at LSE we are actually developing research along those lines, trying to answer those questions. Some of my colleagues in the economics department work precisely on those questions and very successfully. So thank you, Abebe. Sara, would you like to add to this?
Yes, indeed. Thank you very much. I think making the case is based on evidence, as as Abebe has said, and I think we don't have enough data in some instances to make that case. So for instance, when we're talking about soil and soil fertility and its ability to capture and sequester carbon, it's still, let's say, a science that is known, but it's not fully how to capture and track and map this on GPIS. We have the capabilities of doing it, but we haven't done it sufficiently. And we do have carbon markets now. And so, to make those carbon markets really work and that financing that you can unlock on those, which could be catalytic, you need to have the mapping of the evidence of that, of actually sequestering taking place in hectares and hectares of reforested or restored landscapes. And with that type of evidence, then you can actually make a case for different prices and different pricing on that market, which could then unlock a lot of development finance. And I think somebody mentioned ecosystems, payment for ecosystem services. I saw that in the chat, but the regulatory environment for that and the case for that for private and public investment is really this evidence that we need. And we can start it in a small way or in a large way. And I think the locust invasion that Abebe talked about presents us an opportunity. We now have systems of killing the hopper locust, but also the eggs. And in that process, we can improve soil and map that. So that's one way of doing it. We're also tracking climate finance, whether it's for adaptation and mitigation. We have many reports coming out with different types of indexes, asking finances to really trace and see if they are supporting adaptation to climate for smallholder farmers and other actors in food systems or mitigation. And I think there's very little going into adaptation. There's more going into mitigation globally if you look at renewable energies and so on. And really, it's only about 2%, which is in the hands of smallholder farms, which is exposing and putting our food systems at real risk. We have that evidence. So that's what we hope to actually be able to share when it comes to COP26. This is very important. And we want to be able to demonstrate in 2 or 3 cases that that is not happening. Of course, people are less willing, organizations all around the world, to demonstrate that they're falling short of what they've been saying in terms of adaptation. But I think there's a case to be said there. And then private sector finance is increasingly important because public resources are dwindling. And I think the environmental and social governance frameworks that many private sector companies are using to say that they're making, moving or responding to climate change is very limited because we have very different definitions and interpretations of that. There needs to be a global movement to harmonize those indexes of what do we mean when we are talking about sustainable development finance, when we talk to the private sector who are looking at other metrics of measurement. There's a big opportunity here to harmonize the measurements and indicators because a lot of money is being spent in this field to gather evidence, and then it doesn't correlate. You cannot compare apples and pears with different stakeholders talking about different things. And so I think it's a great opportunity for the Firoz Lavaji Institute now for Africa, which has just been launched. And I think Tim Allen had that wonderful video at the beginning of the session to really, have you maybe and others who are academic looking into the various metrics and indices so that we can really harmonize and talk about what it is that we want to change in terms of evidence. So maybe I stop there for now.
No, it makes a lot of sense, and it's extremely helpful to hear this. Thank you, Sara. I'm aware of the time, and the discussion is so fascinating that I think we are 15 minutes before the end, and I have a few questions that are very important that came up in a Q&A box. Jane, do you want to add something about new research questions before we take the questions from the audience, or?
Just go on with the questions, please.
I was asking questions about new kind of new research evidence needed from us researchers, but maybe that question was particular. You are already producing them, so I believe it was very much a question for Sara and Abebe in the design of their programs. Unless you want to add something to this, Jane? Or should I take the question from the audience?
It's okay. Just proceed with the questions from the audience.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. So we've had a number of questions that relate to environmental issues, about water waste, let me just briefly look at them. We have question on regenerative agriculture. How important is it to improve food security in Africa? We have questions on recycling water and organic waste from urban centers, whether that's also something that you are working on. What's the role of those elements in improving the future for food security in Africa? I think I will stop there and take maybe if one of you would like to answer these questions. Abebe, yes?
Yeah, okay, thank you so much. These are very important, very interesting questions, regenerative agriculture. The answer is, of course, yes. And Africa provides, a kind of scenario where you can find almost everything. And these are opportunities. Already these are happening, zero tillage, conservation agriculture, climate smart agriculture, and so on. A lot of these kind of practices already exist. And we have a very excellent example, for example, on conservation agriculture in Zambia in this regard. So the answer in short is definitely yes.
Thank you. Water.
On the recycling.
Recycling?
Yeah, again, interesting question. You see, when we talk about agri-food systems, most of the discussion centers on the production side, unfortunately. Well, it's true, it must be produced first, and then along the whole value chain. But the consumers are important, very important stakeholders, and healthy diets, it's not just nutritious, but healthy diet is also an important component. FAO now is working with mayors of cities and municipalities in the context of green cities development. So it's using urban agriculture as a point of entry, but also linking it with agriculture. And therefore, in the process, using resources, including recycling and organic waste management. So we have very strong stakeholders in the urban milieu, not just, so food production is no more an exclusive domain of rural sector. It can also be produced in the urban sector. It's happening. We are learning from experiences in Asia, in Latin America, and in fact, in some African countries, there are also good examples, and FAO is trying to share experiences using these good practices.
Thank you, Abebe. Sara, would you like to?
I think it's important to also note that small towns are also very important in the urbanization process in Africa, right across Africa. They play a critical role. And small towns manage waste and water very differently from maybe larger urban areas. And we also know that agriculture produces a lot of waste. So these days, and I think Abebe can also attest to this as well as Jane, we do have these rice intensification models where you can also have fish farming and use those combined models to have fish, also boost the productivity of rice. So it's really integrated intensification, sustainable agriculture intensification we're looking at. So these systems are not divorced from one another. And I just came from a site where they are actually using wastewater. It's a small town in a wastewater plant, a small wastewater distilled setting, to further horticulture and other types of agriculture from that. But we also must remember blue water is not only, green water is not only recycling waste. It is also green water that you can actually do, rainwater harvesting, very old system, where you can capture really heavy rainfalls and store it for many months for productive use. And when you restore catchment areas, this is also providing green water runoff and actually preventing that and using water more efficiently. So using the same amount of water, but deploying it more. And I think those are the agricultural practices that we want to actually support and promote. But I did see one other question that I would like to respond to, which was, I think, the question was, are we going to make conditionalities, take more into account local and regional markets rather than international and delocalized ones? I think we are focused very much on local transformation and transformation of local systems. That's why we do have concessional financial instruments. But having said that, we also are changing and introducing other instruments that work directly with the private sector and provide these guarantees where they feel it's too risky to invest, and encourage them to have inclusive models where they can offtake, buy from smallholder farmers. We've seen these closed systems where they provide inputs and also purchase at a fair price. Giving farmers market access really encourages them to invest. And when you look at these systems, and the prosperity of the community is immediately evident. I think we need to, document these cases much more, and that offers partnership opportunities. Feroz Lavage Institute, like yourselves, to document these cases so that they can be scaled up, within the country, within, other places and contexts which look like that in a very practical way, and say these are solutions that maybe governments should be looking more into in pushing the agenda for transformation. Back to you, Stephanie.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you very much. Jane, I was wondering whether you would like to tell us whether the recycling of water, what is the place of water management in the program that you develop and work on with small farmers? If you can do so in a couple of minutes. Sorry, I'm just.
Okay, so I won't talk too much about water, but I was just going to add to the recycling of waste food. Which is or kitchen waste, which is something that is really now taking shape, where the waste that is coming from either processing or is coming from the kitchen. Now we have a program with some of my colleagues in the animal production, who are trying to actually use this waste that is generated either from the household or from processing as feed for to grow worms, which are then used in feed. So that is like a way of recycling. So of course, there's a lot of waste that is generated from in the urban areas, and many of our cities are actually full of, have those places where garbage is dumped, and you don't know where is it supposed to go. So there are these waste management programs that some of the research is focusing on. How do we recycle waste either into like I said, feed for especially for chicken. For example, in our program where we training processors of fruits and vegetables, we are trying to actually use the waste from processed fruits to supplement feed, and see how, for example, if you use mango peel, for example, as a supplement in chicken feed, to supplement the yellow color that is usually added to the feed to give you the yellow yolk. Is that a better way to use the waste rather than taking it to the garbage bin? So those are some of the recycling measures that can be put in place as a better way to manage waste rather than just landfills.
Thank you, Jane. It's extremely interesting to hear this. One day you and I should talk about how it influences yields. I'm very interested in those topics. Before moving to the closing remark of this.
Stephanie, before, sorry, just 1 minute. There was one question, very interesting question, if you are going towards closing, on food sovereignty. The question was, has the COVID-19 pandemic challenged some rural development paradigms? For example, giving more relevance to concepts of food sovereignty in policy agenda.
Yes.
Do you see this as an opportunity? I thought we needed to take up this, say something.
Please do. I haven't seen this one yet. Please do.
Yeah, it is a very interesting question also. Well, there are strong voices, some voices in favor of food sovereignty among some countries. But what we have learned from COVID-19 experience is that we are interconnected. COVID-19 experience is that we are interconnected. But also there is less understanding and clarity of the concept itself of sovereignty. Some of them would confuse it with kind of autarky, for each country to produce its own food, kind of food self-sufficiency, which it's not really realistic. So if we are talking about food sovereignty as the right of peoples to healthy and culturally appropriate food, and so on, produced ecologically sound, and so on, this is desirable, and this is what we're talking about. For empowering the people to define what they want to consume, and also to define their own food and agriculture systems. This is coming actually very vividly in the dialogues towards the Food Systems Summit, the national dialogues. It keeps coming, not much through the COVID-19 window, but as part of the Food Systems Summit. It will be very interesting looking forward how this is going to evolve. Thank you.
Thank you, Abebe. I think we don't have the time for the last question I had prepared. So I would like to thank you all very much for your contribution to this exciting event. I've learned a lot listening to your presentation and your discussion. I wish I could invite you to be guest speaker in my teaching. I think for our students, it's extremely important, interesting, inspiring to listen to you as direct stakeholders in the changes that are currently taking place in Africa. To you, Jane, as a researcher working with small farmers, I hope they have found the discussion inspiring and that it will inspire them to follow your step, to work on those very important issues. LSE is an education institution, and I wanted to briefly mention the fact that for us it is extremely important to give our students a good insight on the kind of work that they can do, and I think for the center it is also an important element. As a researcher, I think as researchers, our community of researchers, I would like to thank you for giving us a lot of food for thought, for sharing maybe some optimism around the fact that opportunity may have created opportunities as well by maybe creating a renewed interest in issues around food security. It's been a pleasure for me to listen to your presentation. Thank you very much also for all of you who attended the event. Thank you. I hope we have the opportunity to work again in the future together and to hear you talk. Thank you very much, everyone.